Are there cases in the past where the helpline has said, gosh, we don't think you should call, blah, blah, blah? Of course, absolutely. And that is not the standard practice. That is not what the helpline is doing today. That is not, it doesn't exist to hide criminals. Could you imagine? Could you imagine like how much more legal trouble the church would be in if that whole system was set up like just to protect criminals? No, you want to keep an institution out of legal trouble, you help it obey the law, and that's what they're doing.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and truth claims. And in today's episode, I have with me Jennifer, it's Roach, isn't it? You have Lee's there.
Jennifer Roach Lees. I got married, so tack
Oh,
the Lees onto the end.
oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
And today we're going to be talking about quite a sensitive topic and a controversial topic. And this is one that, I try to keep up to date with what's happening in the media and, sexual abuse cases that happen in the church. And we're going to talk about the Boy Scouts in America as well. But this is one that I don't have great expertise or understanding in. And Jen, you're involved a lot at FAIR, and you've written and spoken on this topic. And I don't really want to approach this issue because often on this channel I engage with a lot of church history or truth claim topics, and there's a lot of like critics versus apologetics. But really, like any sex abuse is just terrible, and it happens both outside and inside the church, and it needs to be condemned. And I think we just want to have more understanding about this topic, more clarity about the church's approach and its policies when it comes to sex abuse as well. And want to bring up some cases where if there has been any cover-ups, and just to have more clarity on this as well. Because in the last 10 or 15 years, a lot of people have left the church more over church history or truth claim topics, right? But in the last few years, people are concerned about things to do with the church, the institution. Is it good? Either with the church's wealth or particularly with sex abuse. And so this is something I think it's important to discuss and dive into. But maybe we could begin with your background. I believe you're a convert to the church.
I am. I got baptized about almost 6 years ago.
Okay, you're pretty new then, pretty new to the church. Maybe tell us a little about that story. And I know you shared publicly in other places that you also were a victim of abuse. Now, don't feel like you need to share anything about it unless you want to, but maybe talk about, joining the church, a little bit about your background, and then why you became so involved in being one of the main researchers on this topic of sex abuse in the church.
So I grew up in like just the normal, regular Protestant church. I had childhood friends who were Latter-day Saints. I was sort of exposed to it, but also really heavily taught by my own church where I grew up. Like, that's a cult. You like all the crazy. We watched the God Makers, like the whole 9 yards. I grew up. I went to a Christian university. I went to divinity school after that, which is a 4-year master's degree that basically is the entry level pastoral degree. So you study Greek and Hebrew, you do lots and lots of reading, some practicum work, did that, started working for churches, loved it, had a great time. I also got a separate master's degree in counseling because obviously those two worlds intersect so much. Today I work as a professional licensed therapist, so at least I'm using one of my degrees for work. I joined the church 6 years ago, and it actually, it's interesting because it kind of does intersect with the abuse stuff. The Me Too movement was just beginning. There were a lot of stories going around about more high-profile women, actresses, singers, stuff like this, who people would recognize, who were telling their stories of abuse. And the newspaper in the town where I grew up, which is in California, I think they were looking to tell a more down home, representative, it happens here kind of story. So it wasn't that I was famous, but just that mine was sort of a typical story. So they ran a front cover story on the abuse that I had gone through at the church where I grew up.
And did that happen whenever you were like a child or a teenager?
As a teenager. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, the the weird part of how it connects to the church is the main reporter who was writing about me. He and his family are members of the church, and is really what got me like introduced to the Book of Mormon. Um, just sort of a good resource of somebody to ask questions to. I started meeting with the missionaries, met with missionaries for about 9 months. Finally got baptized. Finally got baptized, and that was almost 6 years ago.
Very good. How was it sort of transitioning from, being in a Protestant church and the beliefs you had then to shifting to Latter-day Saint, not just beliefs and our doctrinal beliefs, but I guess the culture as well is a little bit different.
Yeah, doctrinal beliefs was easier than you might imagine because I had been to divinity school. I had studied all of the problems with the Bible and was very aware of the Protestant church's own problems in history and all this stuff. So it's not like I went from a system I didn't think had any issues into a system I thought was perfect. Um, but I was really used to thinking about scripture and doctrine in like complicated layered ways. So that transition was pretty easy. The cultural transition was a little different. I was living in Seattle at the time. I live in Utah now, and those are two pretty different worlds. But I love it here. The church is obviously huge here. Like 80 or 90% of the people in my neighborhood go to my ward. So it's really really different.
Wow. So then how did you transition from you joined the church? I believe you were very much involved in interacting with FAIR as you were investigating,
Yeah.
and then after you joined, you've been involved with that organization. How did that
Mhm.
transition then to you? You're a therapist, as you said, and you've had
Mhm.
pastoral experience in other churches to
Mhm.
then being one of the prime researchers in our space on sex abuse in the church.
Yeah, I mean, it happened honestly when that big Arizona case came out in the newspapers. I've been working with FAIR already on some other topics. I was working on um, bishop youth interviews and the dynamics there, and what's good about that, and what's difficult about that. But when the Arizona case came out, like I sort of recognized right away the way that it had been framed. The initial story, it's run by the AP. It's an incredibly respected reporter. He does all of the work in the past on like the Catholic Church. There's a movie about him, right? Like he's incredibly persuasive, great writer. And I read his article about the Arizona case and thought, I know intuitively that you're framing some of this in a way to make the church look awful. The abuse is awful. Nobody is disputing that at all, and the details around how the church handled that, it just made everyone look terrible. And so I kind of decided, like, well, I want to figure out what has actually happened in this case. I've read darn near every document that has been through the court in that case, and that's thousands of them. Um, gave a talk on it the next year. The following year, I started on my research for abuse in Boy Scouts.
Yeah.
Kind of just gone from there.
And we want to talk about some of those specific issues and things in this
Mhm.
interview, but that's sort of good to understand your background, how you very much became interested in this topic. So I think we can maybe begin with talking about like the church's current policy and approach when it comes to abuse. It even has an article which I read through yesterday on how the church approaches
Yeah.
abuse. Is there anything you want to share about some of the policies or practice it has when it comes to trying to prevent or handle abuse?
Yeah. Well, if you go on the internet and you kind of just read, like, what do other people say the church is doing, you will come across the opinion that says, oh, everything they have is set up to hide and protect abusers. Um, and then if you go read the church's article, it says, no, like we report abuse, we stop abuse when we can. Here's all the things that we're doing. And those are two really, really different storylines. Part of what In my opinion, part of what is happening there is across the board, churches, schools, any kind of organization that deals with children, um, in the past has dealt with abuse terribly. We didn't know what to do. I wrote a paper for Mormon History Association a couple years ago that's basically on the history of how have churches engaged with sexual abuse pretty much
Well,
since
that's
World War
probably actually a
II.
good thing to maybe even before we talk about how the church is currently handling
Yeah,
abuse, like maybe you could briefly touch on like
yeah,
historically, because I think I do agree with you. Because now I work at a primary school and we have a
yeah.
lot more safeguarding training about what you do, being aware of signs if a child discloses something, who you report it
Mhm.
to. Whereas
Yeah,
probably maybe going back 20, 30 years ago, we probably wouldn't have had all these policies and
yeah.
procedures.
Um, if you go back to like the 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, it's 100% stranger danger. Um, People believed someone was going to grab their child and pull them into the bushes. Don't talk to strangers in the park. Don't interact with anybody you don't know, and then you'll be safe. And that was probably since World War II, like 25 years of how organizations have dealt with stuff. So even now, stranger danger has a very strong hold in many people's minds. Started to move in the 70s into primary family incest. It just got a lot of attention. There were a couple movies that featured that as a theme. And so people almost made this giant jump from, oh, it's strangers to no, it's your dad or your grandpa or your uncle or something. Um, but probably more people in this category than there are in the stranger danger category, but it still misses the vast majority in the middle, which is kids who are abused by somebody they know and trust. Um, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like a person who's living in their home. Um, our church is no different than how other churches have dealt with this. We, as a society, have gotten better at how we talk about these things, and now it isn't uncommon to find even an average person saying, "Oh yeah, abuse can happen in any economic sphere, in any kind of family." Like most people now have the understanding, like abuse isn't some weird thing that happens to other people, to bad people's families. So our church, um, really going back to the 1980s, started to recognize, along with every other church, this is a problem, and started the baby steps of how do we even deal with this. Their system today, in my opinion, is pretty sophisticated. There are criticisms. The two primary criticisms are, unless backgrounds are required by law in the country or state where the church is operating, we don't require background checks right now. Um, and then the issue with bishops and mandated reporting, we can address those in a minute. But first, let me talk about like the things the church does do that help keep kids in our church safe.
Yeah.
That they're if you've grown up in our church, you might not recognize these practices as having anything to do with keeping kids safe. Probably the most boring one is honestly one of the most effective, and most people have not thought of it as a child protection, and that's we sustain people in sacrament meeting. And you might be thinking, like, what in the world does that have to do with anything? Um, if you are a Protestant and you want to work with children, you can pick any church you want to attend. It can be your neighborhood church. You can drive 45 minutes away and go to a church. You can get there, you can get involved, you can volunteer. They'll happily, put you in with the third graders to teach Sunday school. But for the most part, that's not announced in church. No one is notified or aware that you are now working with children. Um, if you had some nefarious ideas about what you wanted to do to kids, that's about the sneakiest way that you could do it while also being like hidden in plain sight. In our church, because boundaries are geographic and because we talk about who is doing what in the church through sustainings and in sacrament meeting, if someone was getting sustained in your ward and you already knew, like, ooh, like that guy's creepy with kids, you might not feel strong enough to raise your hand in sacrament meeting and object, but you certainly could go talk to the bishop. You certainly could escalate it from there if you needed to. There's no hiding in the same way that there's hiding in other churches. You could show up on Sunday, this Sunday at a Protestant church, say, "Hey, I'm really excited to be here. I want to get involved." They put you through a little class. Maybe they'll give you a background check, and you're working with kids in 6 weeks. Um, In our church, you actually have to sit around and wait.
Right.
You
I
can't
guess we
walk in
don't
the,
volunteer for certain
yeah,
callings or positions. You have to wait until you're called. So I guess you're saying that if you are, you want to do not nice things to children,
mhm.
if you are
You-
an abuser, that you may have to wait a while to get called. Now, I guess you can go around and visit other churches, other congregations, but you wouldn't be called to a calling unless you were actually your membership records were in that ward.
That's right. Yeah. And everybody in the ward would know you're teaching the such and such class. If you had a reputation of that guy's sketchy, you can't hide. So the fact that our boundaries are geographic, that everybody knows what everybody else is doing, is that going to completely prevent child abuse? No, of course not.
Yeah.
And if you're an abuser and you have the choice between two churches, one where you could go and get access to kids in 6 weeks and no questions asked, really, and ours where you might have to endure calling as the librarian for 3 years, and then another one as the assistant finance secretary. Like where's the low hanging fruit? They're going to go to the other one. Um, our church has lower rates of abuse than other churches have. We'll get into that. That's my Boy Scout research. When abuse happens in our church, and it does happen, another protection that we have is every member of the church has a membership number, and that membership number follows you wherever you go. In other churches, if you picked up and moved to Florida, there's no communication between the evangelical or Protestant church you would become involved with and the church you just came from. The, you could have been a terrible person in that last church, and your new church would never, ever, ever know. In our church, it doesn't work that way. You have a number, that number follows you. The leadership at your new board would see your records. If you had been abusive to kids, there's a notation on your record. The new bishop will see that, and it will say, do not give this person a calling with youth or children. Um, I honestly, I think that's one of the things that drives our rates of abuse down.
Right. Um, yeah, so and that's something that I think we've never really thought about too much before as a way to perhaps prevent abuse. I don't know how much of this was intentional or if this is just sort of a perk about the way that the church
I think it's just a
operates.
perk mostly.
Yeah, but that's actually good to take into account. And like you said, it doesn't completely prevent it, but those are ways that it might lower it a little bit. Because say if somebody joined the church and they wanted to abuse children,
Mhm.
they might have to wait until they are called or in
Yeah.
that position, and it may not be, I guess, as easy to access as maybe in other churches, as you said. I might just read what the church has to say in the first two paragraphs. This is
Yeah.
just them summarizing their sort of, I think, the doctrinal position on abuse. They say, as followers of Jesus Christ, we condemn abuse in any form. Abuse is a serious public health concern and is against the law in many countries. It is also forbidden by the commandments of God. No one should abuse another, and no one should have to endure abuse. Protecting and caring for others was a priority of Jesus Christ in his life, and it is a priority in his church today. The Savior warned his disciples, whoso shall offend one of these little ones, which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck and that he were drowned in the depths of the sea. These are powerful words of condemnation from the Savior. The church is continuously looking for ways to improve its efforts to prevent and stop abuse and to care for those whose lives who have been harmed by abuse. I think that's a great summary of the church's doctrinal ideal and standard and position when it
Yeah.
comes to abuse, and quoting, what the Savior said as well, how much he is against the abuse.
Hmm.
But the church has said at the bottom that it's seeking ways to improve, to try to prevent and stop, and to try to help those who have been abused. At least that is
Hmm.
the doctrinal standard or
Yeah.
ideal. And we'll maybe talk next about practice. But one question I have is, if somebody has been found to be an abuser,
Hmm.
is that immediate excommunication? Or obviously, there would be
Hmm.
some disciplinary, or could it be disfellowship? Like, I guess, what's the protocol if
Yeah.
somebody has been found to be, a sex abuser or physical abuse as well?
Yep.
What's sort of the protocol for what happens to them?
Yeah. The current protocol is that they would be disfellowshipped, and it depends upon how fast that happens. Of
Does it
are
depend
they
on the
in?
seriousness as well of the abuse?
Um, The seriousness is determined by the crime level, right? So in one sense, yes, not that does not mean any abuse is okay. Um, but like it's one charge to have a sexually charged conversation with an 11-year-old, and it's a different charge to have complete sex with them.
Right.
So where the line is on whether you get disfellowshipped over that, I don't know. What I do know is if you get charges, like that's going on your church records too. The question also depends upon like what era are we talking about? Because if you're talking about the 1980s, or I mean even into the 90s, if the church finds out someone's a sex abuser, disfellowship probably did not happen. That would not have been the policy then. One of the things that makes talking about sexual abuse so complicated is this delayed reporting phenomenon. Most abuse victims don't talk about their abuse right away.
Right.
Um,
Usually
the,
years, decades later.
the average age of first disclosure of childhood abuse is actually 53.
Oh my goodness.
So that they're waiting many decades. So somebody who's 53 today, their abuse happened maybe 40 years ago and would have been handled under the policies of 40 years ago. So we have these historic cases, but current contemporary people, and those people have a right to be upset and complain about how their cases were handled back then. Um, but it's also comparing apples to oranges.
Right. I guess it makes it more difficult. Do you know what are the reasons why? Often that's like the average age for people to talk about their sexual abuse. Is it because of fear, or was it because people didn't we didn't maybe were as aware back then, people didn't listen as much, or is it just recognizing, oh, in hindsight that was abuse, and maybe at the time they saw it as like almost somewhat normal?
Um, so all of those certainly, in addition to there's so much shame around it. Um, Abuse victims very often don't want to talk about it because of this deep belief that it means something about them.
Right.
Um, there's a um, paper that I read, and I'm blanking on the author right now, but he cites police research that says even if you show a picture to a child of them and their abuser in the middle of an abuse act, like the guy has recorded it, and you show the kid a picture, there's a certain percentage of kids that will say, "That's not me. That didn't happen to me. That's somebody else," right? Because they just can't.
That's so
And
hard.
yeah, abuse victims are also notorious for they tell a story and then they take it back, and they tell a story and they take it back. It's not that they're lying, it's not that they're trying to be deceitful. It's they want to say this big true thing, and the consequences of that and the fear of that is so overwhelming, especially if you're a child. They're like, no, 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 I was just kidding. Um, I think also adults believe that disclosure of child abuse is something that it isn't. They think a kid is going to say to them, "Hey, I want to talk to you. My uncle is doing this thing to me, blah, blah, blah. I think he's abusing me. What should I do?" That's how adults think that conversation is going to go. And it isn't, usually it's not. The abuse that's caught in childhood most of the time is caught inadvertently. It's not caught because a kid got brave and decided to talk to their parents. It's caught because somebody figures out, like, wait a minute, what is going on here? And an adult starts to piece things together. Um, Teenagers are a tiny bit different, where teenagers are more likely to like give you a little breadcrumb of information, see how you're going to react, but it's a small enough breadcrumb that they can take it back super, super easily. And they might try a few breadcrumbs here and there. They're trying to disclose to adults, and those adults, I guarantee you, would say, "I care about abuse. If I knew about abuse, I would stop it." But the kid is trying to disclose to them and they don't see it. They don't know what's happening. So mostly adults miss it.
Right. So I want to talk next about what's the protocol that the church follows if a member of clergy, who I believe would be, the bishop or stake president, if if somebody, whether or not it's a victim or a perpetrator, comes and reports abuse to them, and I believe this is quite complex because it can kind of depend on the country or even in the United States, what state you're in.
Yeah,
But what's the protocol they have to follow, and maybe talk about the hotline and the Kirk McConkie law firm and talk
yeah,
about that.
yeah. So um, I can't speak to other countries, but in the United States, in all 50 states, if a victim goes to an adult and says, "This has happened to me, my uncle has done this thing," um, that's free game for reporting. There's no law anywhere that says a clergy person can't report that, whether from our church or some other church. Where it gets dicey is when it's kind of under the banner of confession. In
So if
our
it's the
church, we
perpetrator that goes and confesses
Mhm.
to doing abuse on someone else.
Correct. So in our church, we don't have like formal confession, but if you're in a meeting with your bishop and you happen to admit that you're doing this to kids, um, technically that qualifies as confession. There are reasons to protect that. There are reasons to not protect that. It's a complicated issue. And in the United States, that piece is different in many, many states. In the, like the Arizona case, for example, the father in that family abuses both daughters, kind of peripherally abuses their boys as well. At one point, he admits to his bishop this is happening. Um, that act right there, it is protected under clergy client privilege. But it got real complicated because they called his wife into the meeting, and she is not under the same protection, right? So now all of a sudden, like is that broken? That's actually the crux of why that case is still in court, is what is protected and what isn't protected. In certain places, the protections for clergy have been entirely taken away. And we also can look at other fields where there is no such like um, confession ability. The rate of like catching people goes down, not up. That if your goal is we want to find the children who are being abused, allowing a place where a perpetrator could go to their bishop and say, "Hey, I did this thing," and the bishop can work to get them some help, that is a better outcome than that guy never ever confessing it to anybody and driving it like deeper into the darkness. It's pretty rare that someone confesses their abuse to their bishop or anybody. So on the one hand, we're talking about situations that almost never happen. And on the other hand, one of the biggest abuse cases in 2 decades, it did happen.
Okay, so let me just ask this just to clarify so I understand correctly. So you're saying if a victim, be it a child or a teenager, or it could be an adult, were to go to a bishop and report that they have been abused by someone in the ward or in the stake, you're saying there's nothing stopping the bishop from calling straight to the authorities, but if it were the perpetrator,
Mm-hmm.
then that could fall under clergy privilege. But in both cases, would the bishop have to call the hotline, or would that depend on if it was the perpetrator or the victim?
Well, the bishop would be doing the right thing to call the hotline, if even if it is the victim. The hotline, yes, you're going to get to talk to the church's lawyers and figure all of that out. Um, but don't separate that too far from how do we care for this victim. Let me give you an example. In the state of Utah, there's a law that says if you're a 16-year-old and you are in a relationship with somebody who is 17 and they turn 18, if the two of you are having sexual relations, that's not a crime, right? Sometimes they call those Romeo and Juliet laws. It actually, I think they extended up. The person can be 6 years older than the minor, and it's not illegal. However,
So you're
same
saying a
state,
22-year-old and a 16-year-old can be having a relationship that has a sexual component to it and it's not considered illegal?
it's not considered illegal as long as it's consensual.
Huh. Okay. I didn't know that. Is that just
Um,
in Utah or
it's
maybe other
in
states as well?
most, yeah, most U.S. states have that.
Oh, okay.
I the relationship has to be couched as we are boyfriend and girlfriend, not this is my boss at my part-time job, or this is my teacher, or there's some kind of power differential. Um, but yeah, they call them Romeo and Juliet laws, and they are in most U.S. states. Here's where it gets weirder, though. In Utah, if two 13-year-olds confessed to their bishop that they were making out, doing some heavy petting, like whatever, um, the bishop might say, "Oh, that's not illegal," and it turns out it actually is. In Utah, nobody can sexually touch a 13-year-old, not even another 13-year-old. And so the bishop, in trying to figure out how do I care for these kids, has inadvertently stumbled upon a situation where that's technically considered child abuse. It's not a felony, it is a misdemeanor. Um, but how is he supposed to know that?
Very
Right? So
counterintuitive to what you would think.
absolutely, right? So calling the helpline to figure out what is my legal responsibility here. If we want bishops to follow their legal responsibility, and we do, we have to give them some help to do so.
Yeah.
Because nobody would know that. In a broader sense, well, let me back up. If you ask the internet, you'll say, "Oh, they call the helpline, and the helpline tells them, you hide this, you don't tell it to anybody, you blah blah blah." Numbers are hard to come by here, right? Because the church doesn't produce the numbers of how many calls they get or how many cases are reported because of the helpline. On that topic, I would refer you to this most recent fair conference from August of this year, where the man who's the head of the helpline came and spoke and basically said, "I'm not going to give you the numbers, but the vast majority of cases, when someone calls and it's abuse, it's very, very clear you have to also call your local authorities."
Right. So, okay, I'm trying to think where to go next. Um, so if a child were to disclose, or a perpetrator, to someone who's not considered clergy, so would that, like any other calling, be considered
Mm.
not clergy? Like, say for example, if you're a youth leader or seminary teacher, and they come and report you, you could just call straight to the authorities.
Yeah,
But
absolutely,
that's right.
nothing's stopping you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the gray area is just when it comes to when it's clergy.
yeah, that's right. In some states, every single adult is considered a mandated reporter. So it doesn't matter if you told it to the grocery store worker, they would
Yeah.
still have to call and report.
Yeah, and I'm just looking up here in the UK. I don't know if you know this. If it's mandatory reporting for clergy in the UK to go straight to the
Mhm.
authorities,
Mm.
or if there's clergy privilege. I don't know.
I
I'm trying
don't
to look that
know.
up.
Um, in areas where the Catholic Church is really strong, there tend to be laws that allow for some confessional privilege. So I don't know.
Um, this is what AI says. Said a Latter-day Saint bishop in the UK has a duty to report authorities for child abuse. Um, okay, that's what it says, but maybe someone can fact check if it's
Yeah.
different. Okay, well, I want to come back to the two sort of specific cases, but I can understand that, every state has different laws, like you were said, what's considered like legal and not,
Mm-hmm.
what's considered abuse, clergy privilege, because some states the bishop or the member of clergy would be considered a mandatory reporter, so you report.
Mm-hmm.
In other states it might be, no, this has to be kept confidential, and legally you have
Yeah.
to keep it confidential. Is it true that in some states there's a bit of a gray area where there's an instance where you're not a mandatory reporter, but you're also not forbidden by clergy privilege? So
Mm-hmm.
you're like exempted from it, but you also can. And I guess one question people has is what sort of the advice given in those situations? Because I've heard people say that when there is that gray area, that they've been advised by, people on the hotline, lawyers,
Mm-hmm.
to not go to the authorities or to not speak in
Yeah.
court because there's an exemption. But someone might say, oh,
Yeah.
if they're not forbidden, then
Yep.
wouldn't the moral thing to do to go to the authorities?
Um, the Arizona case is a great example of this because the guy confesses to his bishop The bishop understands one set of information that doesn't really actually represent what's really going on in the home. Um, he calls the hotline. The hotline says, you've got to get that guy or his wife to report. That's the only way you bishop, can't report. Um, it turns out he probably could have reported and not been in legal trouble, although there's cases in other states where someone reports and then they can get sued for that. So it's stupid that you need an attorney to help you figure this out. But the advice he got was try and get the the father or the mother to report on themselves. Honestly, that's in my opinion where this whole thing breaks down. The mother, um, she knows way more than the bishop knows. They've confessed a tiny, tiny, tiny little portion of what happened to him, and the mother pretty much knows everything, and she is the one who allows it to go on. She does a jail stint over this. She's out now. She loses custody of all her kids over this. The mother absolutely had the ability to report, and she didn't. She had the opportunity to take her kids and flee out of state, that the bishop was willing and able to help her do that, to get the family out of state, had so many opportunities to get her children away from this man and didn't.
Okay. So when it came to the bishop in that scenario, it's almost like there's a bit of ambiguity, but he was advised
Mm-hmm.
by the lawyers to not go to the authorities
Mm-hmm.
or not to go sort of, speak in court. But there is, I guess, a bit of ambiguity, but there's fears of a potential lawsuit.
Well, part of why I think, I'm not speaking for the helpline, but part of why that advice gets given in that moment is what the father confessed to him was, in the past, one time I did this to my oldest daughter, and we as a couple have now put in all kinds of safeguards so it never happens again. They actually tell the bishop, the father says, I'm not even living in the home. I'm never around the children alone. She's making sure they're safe. And so the bishop is led to believe one set of circumstances when it was entirely another. He was still living in the home and currently actively abusing that girl, but the bishop didn't know that.
Right. Okay. I want to ask you about, like, obviously every state has their different laws, and clergy privilege is different depending on the state or country. But some people feel that shouldn't, like, morally, would it not be better if mandatory reporting applied to every state?
Yeah.
You've spoken a little bit on this because, on the one hand, then as soon as, abuse is being, told to a bishop, call straight to the authorities. But what's your thoughts on that? Would that not be better?
Um, I think it's a counterintuitive situation where, like, there's part of me that's like, yes, that would be better. Like let's figure out how to get help. And it works out where it isn't better. There's fewer people who are going to tell, like, on themselves. There's even fewer people who are going to tell on someone else because they'll say things like, I don't want CPS to get involved. I don't want those kids to end up in the foster system. So they don't want to make like a legal report where there could be legal consequences. And so they don't go to anybody. If the bishop in that scenario is a mandated reporter and a man is abusing his children, he is not going to go to the bishop and say, oh, by the way, here's what I'm doing, because he knows the next call is to 911, to like emergency services. They're going to come arrest him.
Right.
Um, if there's a confidential place for him to report, he might. It's rare, but he might. And the bishop can figure out, how are we going to get safety to these kids? Is safety already achieved? Like whatever. Um, Mandated reporting is complicated. It produces fewer reports.
Hmm.
I
Yeah, because
so
go
yeah, go
ahead.
ahead. I'm a mental health therapist. So in the past, I've worked with a population where there was just a lot of abuse. I was calling child protective services frequently. Um, and I can tell you for certain, there were times when I knew a client was headed down a path, and my job was to say, like, hey, like, just to remind you, like, I'm a mandated reporter. If you tell me about hurting a child, like, we'll be calling 911. They're not saying anything. Like that's the end of that conversation. Um, if I said, I can hold what you're telling me confidential, confidential does not mean there's no consequences, nothing is going to happen. Um, it can mean all kinds of things. It also can be time bound. I can hold this confidential for whatever amount of time. Now, I as a therapist can't do that. Um, if you want more reports, somehow you've got to be able to have a container for the reports where people are afraid of the legal consequences, but at least you can get like somehow the ball gets started.
Right. Yeah, this is very nuanced and complex because on the one hand, I understand what you're saying that if it's mandatory reporting, then certain abusers or perpetrators will probably not go and speak to a bishop, and if it's kept confidential, they might confess. There might be some disciplinary process. The bishop might be
Mhm.
able to encourage them to go and confess to the authorities, or you know influence the situation somehow. And I think I can see how other people might feel that, if, sorry, my brain's gone blank.
Yeah.
Well, let's see, we can
Maybe
come back to
something
this in a
like
minute.
if there isn't mandatory reporting, aren't we helping hide abusers or helping?
Yes, that's what I was trying. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because if there isn't mandatory reporting, and it's kept confidential, then we're sort of protecting the abuser. And
Yeah.
what if he then can continue to go on and abuse more people, and
Yep.
it's never, brought to court. There's no
Yeah.
charges.
Yeah, there's no clean answer on this. Like, I am incredibly sympathetic to that point of view. I completely get what that means, and I want those people to end up with a court record so that everyone can know that's what's going on with them. At the end of the day, whether you make a confidential spot or whether you don't, there's groups of children being abused that are going to be missed by that system.
Yeah.
We want a system where every child is protected all the time. Every adult who cares about kids wants that. And right now there isn't one. And so we're grappling with which cases of abuse do we want to like catch and be able to help with, because choosing one side means discluding the other side. And I don't know what the right answer is.
And the other point I was going to make as well that came back to my mind is there might be an influx of way more reports of abuse.
Yeah.
And
So,
I think you've said that it might be harder for, if it's child services or if it's the
mhm.
police to investigate them all. But somebody might say, well, that's sort of the problem with the system. And shouldn't they just have to hire more people to deal with the cases? And that's something that, they need to resolve in their end. But because if there was more mandatory reporting, could there then be more victims that could be helped?
um, when a state implements mandated reporting, the number of reports goes up about tenfold, but the number of victims stays the same. So yeah, they could hire more people and work at this level, which I assume is what they have to do anyway, right? Because they're getting so many more calls. But across time, the victim number has stayed stable. That's actually true. Um, if you go all the way back to like the early 1980s, which is kind of the first time any kind of reliable records are begun to be kept on this, all of the things that we have done as a society to try and change and prevent abuse, the rate is still roughly the same.
So what do you think that is? Is it false reports, or is it just like, people are reading too much into things, or as soon as something that sounds like abuse, they just report straight away, or
Um, I think potentially all of those, and sometimes it comes down to like, say the dad is really actually abusing the kid. Like, what do you think is going to happen? So CPS, Child Protective Services, is going to get involved, and they're going to want to hear the story from that kid. And if she's young or even a teenager, they're going to sit down and start asking her questions. And she's immediately going to do that. No, 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 that didn't happen.
mm,
And then that case has fallen apart.
so tough.
Mm-hmm.
And you've talked about this as well, that often most of the abuse occurs in people's homes, and it's often people that are
Yeah.
very close to them as well. Well, why don't we talk next? I want to come back a little bit to the couple of legal cases, but you
Mm-hmm.
did a fair conference on Boy Scouts of
Mm-hmm.
America. So the church was
Yeah.
very involved in Scouts, and then it went through like its bankruptcy. because of all of the sex abuse that happened.
Yeah.
And I believe the church gave, was it around what, 300 million in
Mhm.
sort of compensation for all the victims. And, people can look at that and be really concerned at like, oh my gosh, so much of the Boy
Yeah.
Scout sex abuse came from the church. And you sort of
Yeah.
analyzed a lot of the data on that. Do you just want to share
Yeah.
about that? And
Yeah.
first, I want to say like any abuse is terrible, whether or not
That's
from the
right.
church or not. So we don't want to defend or justify any of it. And abuse
That's right.
happens in every religion, and whether it happens more in one or another, I don't think we don't want to condemn the institution that as a whole. But this is something that happens in
Mhm.
across organizations and institutions. But we should do everything we
Yeah.
can to limit it and lower it. But it's sad.
Yeah. There is no like, yay, we win. We have the fewest children whose lives were ruined, right? Like that isn't it
Yeah,
at
it's not something to
all.
celebrate.
Um, but there is a narrative online that says the church is just only interested in protecting abusers. Children are not safe in this church. This isn't like an apologetic for abuse. It's an apologetic for like, wait a minute, like let's just talk about this honestly.
Yeah, let's
So
just
so
talk about
here,
the data.
yeah, here's the Boy Scout data. Boy Scouts have actually kept really, really good records. Going back like 70 years, they've kept records on the abuse that has happened in various troops. They call them the perversion files. It's an old name, right? We wouldn't call them that today. Most of the time, they get called the P files for short. Um, you or anyone can actually look at all of them. They're online. They're on a database that's owned by the Los Angeles Times. And you can go and search by year or troop number or search up a perpetrator's name. Like you can search it in all kinds of ways. Um, all of those are available online, several, maybe close to 10,000 of them. Um, those files are really, really helpful because answering the question of um, does abuse happen more under one set of circumstances or more under another set of circumstances? That's a really, really, really hard question to answer because how in the world do you track that and set that up? So in these P files, what we have is information about the man, the abuser, his age, maybe his role in scouting, how long he had been involved in scouting, and they ask his religion. Um, it's just a fill in the blank line. So there's no like how devoted are you to your religion? There's none of that. But almost every single one of those files contains that line is filled out. There's some that aren't. When I was doing my analysis, we eliminated the ones that no religion was given unless it was extremely obvious what they were based on other things in the file. But most of those got eliminated. We also eliminated the things that the Boy Scouts earlier considered perversions that today we wouldn't. Like there's homosexual people in the P files, and the Boy Scouts are keeping a file on them just because they're gay. Like not we don't consider that
Not
like to
relevant to
be
this
part of this.
discussion.
Yeah. So of the remaining files, um, really just did like the brute force work of going through and saying like, okay, what religion is this man? List, like to thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And then saying, okay, we know that over the decades, Boy Scout troops from the LDS made up between 30 and 40%, depending on the decade, 30 to 40% of the entire bulk of Boy Scout troops. So you wouldn't be wrong in assuming, well, I bet at least 30 or 40% of the abuse comes from those.
And am I right in thinking what the church paid in, was it 250 or 300 million, whatever it was? Was that around 30% of the total money
Yep.
given in compensation? And you're saying around 30 to 40% of the participants in Boy Scouts market were members of the church. You can
Yeah.
almost understand the church giving that figure in compensation.
Absolutely. But when you look at who was actually doing abuse and what kind of churches do those people belong to, even though you would expect, say, 35% of the abusers to be LDS, they're not. It's 5%.
Oh, wow. It's quite a difference. Though I remember you said in your fair conference that's not something to celebrate because 5% of abuse is still
So
terrible and
awful.
still awful. I guess it's better than knowing that it's like 95% coming from the church. But Okay, that's I guess an important statistic to be aware of.
Yeah, another way of saying the same thing is a kid in the Boy Scouts was 75% less likely to be abused in an LDS troop than in another kind of troop.
Right. And that's based on you going through all the files. This is based
Mhm.
on statistical analysis. This
Yep.
isn't an apologetic to
Nope.
try to defend
That's
defend the church.
just math. Yeah, that's just math.
Okay. Well, that's something that I didn't know until I listened to your conference on it. So I think it's important to be aware of that data, and I think it's good that the church has given that money in
Mhm.
in compensation for the
Yeah,
victims, even though it's more than how many that the church was
yeah.
responsible for. But still, obviously, 5% of victims, that's still a lot of victims when you look at the thousands that were impacted.
One of the things that sometimes people bring up right here is they say, "Oh, all that proves is there is a mechanism in the LDS Church that's suppressing reporting. People didn't want to report; it would have ruined the bad name of the church. They didn't want to make a fuss. LDS members are trained to be passive and to not worry about these things. It I get the worry, but anybody who thinks that has simply never been involved in another church in their life, because like you think the Methodists don't care as much about their church, and there's a certain percentage of them who would never report abuse because they want to protect like the good name of their church. Do those people exist in the LDS Church? Of course. But everyone loves their church. The Lutherans have the same problem. The Baptists do, like everyone does. And so that worry gets kind of moderated because that's not a particular LDS worry. That's just a human being worry.
Right. Um, so we talked a little about the Arizona case. Is there anything else you want to say to that? Like one listener just wrote in just wanting us to discuss it because someone in his ward left the
Mm-hmm.
church over this. And
Yeah.
I guess, is there anything else relevant to that case you want to
Yeah.
bring up about it?
Um, I would like to talk for a minute about around background checks, because sometimes background checks are touted as if we would just do background checks, none of this would be happening.
Which in the
And
UK
so,
we do now.
yeah.
I had to do one for my recent calling, and obviously I work at a primary school, and we have to. I don't know if you
Mm,
call it DBS or if it's just criminal checks, but
mm,
we call it DBS, and it's
okay.
just you go through your criminal history to make
Yeah.
sure you don't have any convictions or anything like that. And on the one hand, I think it's good because you wouldn't want someone working with children who is
Mm,
convicted as a pedophile or something like
yeah.
that. But as you have talked about, it doesn't mean, oh, they're completely safe then with this person. It just shows that
Yeah.
there's no criminal convictions.
The abuser in the Arizona case, his name's Paul Adams. He worked for Border Patrol, meaning he had to pass a federal level background check every single year. A federal check is so vastly different than the kind of check that churches or schools do. Churches and schools can access, like, do you have a conviction? They might be able to access, like, is there something weird, like, going on with you where you don't pay your bills? Like, the level of information that they can get to is really nothing. A federal background check, they're interviewing people who know you, like, they're digging into every single thing. This guy, Paul Adams, probably one of the worst abusers that you could imagine. He was passing the hardest background check to pass every year. And if that guy could do it, background checks are required in many places and we should do them. Background checks might catch a person or two. And for that reason, we should do it.
Yeah,
But anyone who has a clean background check, all that means is not caught. It doesn't mean they've done something. It doesn't mean that we know they haven't. It doesn't mean safe. It means
right.
no record.
So you're saying we shouldn't have a false sense of security, even if someone has, a clean background check.
Yeah.
All that means is that there's no conviction. And on the one hand, I sort of feel like it's good to have the background check so we can eliminate any people that have been
Mhm.
convicted, rule them out.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's not a guarantee. It's not a guarantee.
Here's the complication in that is that delayed reporting dynamic that we talked about. By the time somebody is reporting, most of the time the statute of limitations is long over. So there's nothing they can do. So there's no report to be filed. There's no court to go to. You have lost your right to pursue this
Because in
as a
certain
case.
states, you have to report abuse by a certain age, don't you? Within a certain number of years.
Yep, yep. It used to be that every state had some kind of limit. There are a few states, more and more. I wish every state would do this, but there's more and more that are saying there is no limit on this. The problem that comes up there is if you're, say, 35 and you're ready to talk about the abuse that happened to you when you were 10, um, you have a real evidence problem. That doesn't
Mm,
mean it didn't happen. Um, but if we're going to ask a court of law to say, we are at least reasonably sure that this person do it, you probably don't have evidence to support that. It does not mean it didn't happen. This means they're not going to get convicted.
yeah, yeah, that's true.
And so
Um,
there's no charge, so a background check never finds them.
Yeah, so I think it's important to be aware that while I'm sort of in favor of background checks, I also agree
Uh-huh.
with you to the extent that this doesn't mean that they're completely clean, nothing to be worried about, and that's why, like also in church, whenever you're teaching the youth, you always have to have another adult with you. If you're
Yeah.
giving, children, a lift, another adult
Yep.
with you, or messaging
Which
as
I think
well
is
has to be
really
through the
good.
parents. So it's all
Yeah.
these just extra safety
Yep.
protocols as well,
Yeah.
which is important.
Yeah.
So I want to talk just briefly about this happened in the last, I think it was like 2 years ago, with
Mm-hmm.
Chelsea and John Goodrich.
Mm-hmm.
And I read through the AP article just for a refresher, but just to summarize basically my understanding about what happened. I believe he was a former bishop. I can't remember if the abuse happened when he was a bishop or after he was a
Mm-hmm.
bishop, but I know he was a former bishop. I think he went and confessed to the bishop and
Mm-hmm.
stake president. They were aware. I think the daughter and the mother might have had conversations as well. I'm a bit rusty on this on the
Mm-hmm.
specifics. The bishop, I believe, I think his name was Bishop Miller. He wanted
Mm-hmm.
to, testify, and they wanted to file a lawsuit against him, and Bishop wanted to go
Yeah.
testify. And he was advised by the church's, legal team due to
Mm-hmm.
clergy privilege, he shouldn't. I'm unsure in this case if it was like you're forbidden from doing it due to
Mm-hmm.
clergy privilege or if there's an exemption, and that there is a $300,000 like settlement agreed between her and I can't remember his name. Was it something Riding?
Yeah.
Paul Riding? Yeah, Paul Riding. And some people see that as, did the church just give hush money
Mm-hmm.
to keep them
Yeah.
quiet so then they wouldn't go to court and then the abuser is still roaming free? And the
Yeah.
clergy privilege means that there could be future victims. And I guess people just have concerns about how this looks, how this is handled, whether or not it was legal, how it
Huh?
looks morally, and is
Yeah.
the church trying to protect the institution or even
Uh-huh.
protect the perpetrator from
Yeah.
like a legal lawsuit versus protecting this victim and potentially
Yep.
future victims. I think that's the root of concerns people have when they hear stories
Yeah.
like this is
Yeah.
is the church just trying to protect the institution and the $300,000 settlement agreement. I
Uh-huh.
guess can you talk about that? I
Yeah.
know you've not looked at that as in depth as the Arizona case, but because people just from the outside looking at this can feel really concerned that this is going on.
Yeah. So the part of the conversation here is the difference between hush money and settlement money. Hush money means no court is involved. We're going to give you this money with an expectation that you don't say anything and that you don't go to the court. You're right, I don't know this case as well, but my understanding is that the term hush money doesn't actually fit here. The settlement money ends up at the end of a legal process, not because the church said, oh, here, we'll write you a secret check. um, all churches, including ours, carry an insurance policy. Our church is mostly self-insured, and this is one area where we are not. Carry an insurance policy against abuse happening, and if it does, there's provisions for settlement money for victims. In the US, at least, it works a lot like your car insurance. There's a per incident maximum, and there's a lifetime kind of aggregate maximum. When a victim decides to go through legal channels, she decides to report or take her abuser to court, Um, Most of the time, we're talking about civil court, not criminal court. Criminal court is the state taking that person um, to press charges against them, and maybe the end result is jail. Civil court, people don't go to jail in civil court. The expected outcome is always money. That's the penalty of civil court. Um, Victims face real, actual financial loss because of abuse.
Right, and all the
They,
trauma and everything.
uh-huh. They have delayed education if they finish their education at all, delayed earning potential over the course of their lives. Like all of this is very well documented. People who have been abused, whether it's in the church or not, deserve a settlement. A, a settlement is just money, right? And it doesn't undo what happened. You still have the trauma, you still have to deal with it in all these other ways, but it does make parts of life easier. And there isn't something else for the courts to offer. They have the ability to force payment. And so when you're talking about settlement, a settlement can be an incredibly healing thing for a victim. I got a settlement. I took my abuser to court, to civil court. He didn't go to criminal court. He doesn't have a criminal record. It was too late. He actually works at a church today. They actually know all about it too. But um, I took him to civil court. Most victims, including me, you are never going to go to trial. It's almost unheard of for victims to get all the way there because they don't want to. Like nobody wants that. And so settlement is the expected outcome. The average settlement in the United States is exactly on the nose at $300,000. Why? Because that's the average incident amount that the insurance policies allow for. So she gets a settlement. That's different than, come here, I'm going to give you hush money and you're never allowed to talk. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah, no, I think that kind of makes sense. So you're saying generally in most abuse cases, they tend to go to criminal court versus, or not criminal, sorry. What was
Civil,
the other one?
civil court.
Civils, yeah, civil
Mhm.
versus criminal court, and often it ends in a settlement agreement as opposed to the persecutor being, put into prison.
Yeah, in civil court, there's no possibility for you to be put into prison. It's not, you have not been hit with criminal charges. I couldn't hit my abuser with criminal charges because the statute of limitations had long run out, and the police would say, "I'm very sorry this happened to you, but the, the statute has run. You don't have any options."
But if it's within the statute of limitations, then could it go to criminal court because it would still be considered a criminal charge?
It could. The state are the people who decide if it's going to go to criminal court or not. Do they have a strong enough case? Do they have some evidence that proves to a jury of 12 unbiased people that this happened? As you can imagine, in most abuse cases, there is not strong evidence. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but you can't prove it with physical items most of the time.
Right. And this question, this comes from a listener, and I'll maybe just summarize it after more briefly. He asked, because I think this is sort of the crux of
Mm-hmm.
the fear or the concern people have, and we've kind of been addressing this, but he says, if the role and duty of lawyers is to prioritize the protection, the interest, the resources, and reputation of their client, and in this topic, including the needs and interests of victims in abuse, they asked what are some potential improvements, but before I get that part of his question, they might feel that the lawyers who work for Kurt McConkie, they're primarily there to defend the church and protect the church. And is their first interest to protect the institution from a lawsuit, but also protect the image of the church? And
Mm-hmm.
is there something going on that it's very much like, oh, well, if there has been abuse, let's keep this quiet, let's protect, don't go to the authorities, bishops, stake president, don't
Mm-hmm.
speak at court if there's an exemption, and we'd rather do a settlement agreement and protect the image of the church or the institution from a lawsuit than this going public that we have sex abuse in the
Mm-hmm.
church. And are they
Yeah.
caring more for the perpetrators or the institution versus victims? I think that's sort of the main concern that people have. Is this
Yeah.
what's happening a lot when people are calling into the hotline and there's sex abuse with
Absolutely.
lawyers?
Yeah. So, I mean, if the question is the hotline there to keep the church out of legal trouble? The answer is absolutely 100% yes. Because the best way to stay out of legal trouble is not to commit crimes. So when a bishop calls and says, I've heard about this happening to this kid, they need to know what action do they need to take in order to not commit a crime. And
Right.
so the helpline is helping with that. Are there cases in the past where the helpline has said, gosh, we don't think you should call, blah, blah, blah? Of course, absolutely. And that is not the standard practice. That is not what the helpline is doing today. That is not, it doesn't exist to hide criminals. Could you imagine? Could you imagine like how much more legal trouble the church would be in if that whole system was set up like just to protect criminals? No, you want to keep an institution out of legal trouble, you help it obey the law, and that's what they're doing.
Yeah. And if that was what the hotline was doing in every instance, it would just look terrible if more and more came out as well.
Yeah.
It would be counterintuitive to want to protect the image of the church because the image of the church would be negatively impacted if, in
Yeah.
fact, they are protecting the perpetrators and silencing the victims.
The Arizona case is such a brilliant example in this right here because they tell the bishop you can't report. And if the accusation is it's to protect the good name of the church, it doesn't make any sense. Paul Adams attended maybe a couple times a year. He had never gone past the Aaronic priesthood. He barely paid attention when he was there. He didn't have a calling. He didn't do ministry. He's not an active member in any way. He comes when his kids sing in primary.
So he's not this high
Like,
up leader in the church.
no, no, he barely is involved. Like, what in the world um, would motivate the church to say, yeah, let's put everything at risk and protect this random guy who comes a couple times a year?
And what if somebody were to say that even if there is this clergy privilege in certain states that legally, they're not allowed to go to authorities or if there's a court case to speak because it's confidential. What would you say if somebody says like, well, the church has, billions in wealth. The moral thing to do would be for them to speak up, even if it breaks clergy privilege and technically would be breaking the law, but like morally, that would seem the right thing to, put the perpetrator away. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I have a lot of sympathy to that point of view. And I think there's bravery in saying, like, I don't care what the law says, I'm going to do the right thing and let the consequences follow. Absolutely. There's room and space for that. In the Arizona case, he didn't do that, not because he wasn't brave. He did that because he thought the abuse was over.
Mm.
He thought the father wasn't living in the home anymore. The girl was safe. The mother was making sure everybody was fine. Dad was allowed to come and have some supervised visits. So he doesn't go against what he's told, not because he's a moral coward, but because he's like, all right, I guess things are okay.
Okay. So I want to get the second part of this listener's question because I think it's actually quite a good question.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I quoted what the church said at the beginning, it says the church is continuously looking for ways to improve its efforts to prevent and stop
Mm-hmm.
abuse and care for those whose lives have been harmed by abuse. And I believe they also offer free counseling services to evict
Yeah.
victims, which is good as well. But I think we don't want to say that the church is even acknowledging that there might be things that we
Mm-hmm.
could do better to prevent or
Yeah.
stop abuse. So the rest of his question says, what are some potential improvements the church could make if the leaders shifted in their priorities to make a conscious choice and change to prioritize the interests, well-being, needs, protections, mental and medical health support of the victim and the
Mm-hmm.
potential victims of abuse within the church as higher values than protecting the church institution. So I guess in a nutshell, he's saying, what are some improvements the church could do to protect the victims first over the institution, or at least give that image that
Yeah.
that's what they're doing?
I'll tell you my answer, and most people don't like it. Um, we talked earlier about how most abuse that's caught in children or in teenagers is either caught accidentally or it's caught because an adult close to that kid starts to piece some things together. Many people who would swear up and down that they are completely against abuse and would be morally brave and report any abuse that they ever got a whiff of, they feel squeamish if you ask them to press a kid or a teenager on something weird that they said, right? I'll give you an example. If a girl is talking about her undergarments and her uncle being aware of the color of her undergarments, are you, grown man, going to be comfortable having a conversation with, say, a 14-year-old girl that involves her undergarments? Most people are going to run. If
Yeah,
you
because
have
you
the
might feel like you don't
courage,
want to pry or be creepy, but at the same time, some
yeah,
red flags might be going off in your mind. So it's
that's right.
thinking, what's the best way to handle and approach this?
Um, Being able to ask some follow-up questions and have patience and start piecing things together, that's what catching abuse is. So most people, men and women, if a child is talking about something that like feels gross and is a tiny bit uncomfortable, honestly, we worry about ourselves. We worry about, I don't want to be caught having a conversation with a 14-year-old about underwear. We're changing the subject. Instead of saying, I'm going to ask the really difficult and potentially upsetting next question that might make me look like a creep, but I'm going to do it on behalf of this kid, knowing this might be abuse. So what can the church do? The church, meaning its people, can get some education on what does it mean to actually even uncover abuse, and how brave are you going to have to be to get the details out of a kid.
And I can say, I part of my profession is working in a primary school, regular trainings that we've had and just
Mhm.
recognizing what are some signs of potential child abuse or ways that children might manifest it. It's an important way to be aware of it because often, when you work with kids, they just talk to you all the time about different stuff, and
Yeah.
often it's very easy to dismiss what they say,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes it can be helpful to just have more awareness and
Mm-hmm.
more guidance on what to do or what to say or how to approach it if they've said something that's a bit of a red flag. So one question that I have, and this is a little bit applicable to me in the past year or so, because I've never sort of been close to there being any sex abuse in the church before. And
Mm-hmm.
I've moved around to different wards in the past couple of years, so I'm going to keep it vague. But a man that was in a leadership position in a previous ward that I was in,
Mm-hmm.
who actually served alongside. I don't know if he's been convicted yet, but it's been found out that he was doing sexually inappropriate things with underage girls, which was a bit of a tragedy. And I'm sure you've heard lots of anecdotal stories, and I have of
Mm-hmm.
either bishops or someone in a youth leadership or whatever it was, there being some sort of abuse to someone, whether it was in the church or out of the church. And one concern people have is if people are called to a position like a bishop or, young men's or young women's president. Actually, I don't think we have young men's president anymore, but
Yeah.
some sort of position like that, which we believe is done by inspiration and there's discernment, and then later finding out that they were a child abuser or they wanted to abuse someone. And I understand, we believe people have agency and we all have weaknesses and people can do bad things, but I think that's a question mark people have is how does that even happen that a bishop or an elders quorum president or young women's president could be called and do child abuse, and this causes people, I think, to lose faith in the church and revelation and discernment. I guess what would you say to that? Because I think that's
Yeah.
something that people can struggle with.
The What's implied in the question is that the bishop should have some level of discernment that not only can tell past behaviors, but potential future behaviors done in secret, behaviors that if that person were an abuser, they're extremely sophisticated about hiding. Um, Discernment is a thing, right? Like we believe in that in our church, and it's not magic. It's not a crystal ball. It's not you get to know everything. Um, in my opinion, finding out someone committed abuse in the past while they're in a current, say, young men's calling, that's slightly like less troubling than them getting called to a position and committing abuse while they are in that position. Well, abuse wasn't part of the job description, right? Like that is the agency piece. They chose to do that. Um, but if the level that we're expecting of discernment from anyone in the church is I can perfectly predict what has or might happen, that's really stretching the limits of what discernment actually is.
Okay. I guess my final question to you on this, and maybe if you have any final thoughts, but you've talked about what the church is doing to handle, abuse and try to prevent abuse. Is there anything that you think, the church as an institution, their policies? Because I think in theory their policies seem really good. Is
Mm-hmm.
there anything that you think any improvements that you would suggest to the
Mm,
church and just for us as members of the church? To have better awareness when it comes to
yeah.
abuse as well. And I guess one final question onto that, after you answer that, is those people who are really struggling with sex abuse in
Mm-hmm.
the church, and people saying that the institution isn't good and it's harmful and it's covering up sex abuse, and who are
Mm-hmm.
really wrestling with this. What advice would you give to them as well?
Yeah. Let me start with that one. They're both important questions, but that one really like draws on my heart. I completely get it. Especially some of the big profile cases that have been in the news. They're heart wrenching, and nobody wants to think about this happening in their church. And even if it's thousands of miles away, like it's still our church. Um, it's a little bit of a remnant of some stranger danger, like, oh, things like that don't happen here. We're good people. It might be a little bit of like, well, the church said they were safe. They passed a background check, so they had to be safe. Why weren't they safe? The dissonance that can provide is awful, right? Um, the primary responsibility for preventing and uncovering abuse belongs to a parent. Um, an institution can make all the policies they want, and abuse still happens. And you can see that in our church. We have fantastic policies. We have better policies than anybody else, and abuse still happens.
Yeah.
Um, the antidote to abuse is adults that are close to kids that can see what's going on with them and help get it exposed. So, like, my heart goes out to a person who is heartbroken over what they perceive as the church's response to this. Um, they might be overemphasizing the institutional response, especially as represented from the past, and sort of forgetting to look around and go, wait a minute, like every adult I know in the church is anxious for kids to be okay. Are we still figuring it out? Yeah, just along with every other church and every other school. Show me the school that's got the greatest policies, and I guarantee you abuse still happens there. As a society, we have not fixed this yet, but we're trying. Um, if leaving the church over that kind of heartbreak, they deserve compassion. They deserve all kinds of care from other people. It's a really big, upsetting topic, and it isn't something you have to leave the church over.
Okay.
I forget the first part of your question. I'm sorry.
The first part was just you kind of I think spoke to this a bit, but just generally what you think the church or us as members
Mm,
of the church can do better
mhm.
at handling abuse, of preventing abuse. Any
Yeah,
any improvements you would recommend to things that
yeah,
well, if we had this might just be an improvement, and it seems like the church is saying that they're continuously looking for ways to improve in its efforts to prevent and
mhm.
stop abuse. So
Yeah,
they're open to improvements, and we're learning, and we're
yeah,
growing.
yeah. I mean, that would essentially be my answer is, if you look at the history over the last 40 years, they've constantly implemented better policies as we have become aware of them, and they will continue doing so. If any person alive today knew, here's what you do and zero abuse would happen, um, like I want to talk to them, but nobody has developed a system where an institution has care over children and zero abuse happens.
Yeah.
Every time the church figures out another layer to add, they add it. Just like schools do that care about kids, just like other organizations do that care about kids. we as humanity are still trying to figure this out.
No, well said. Well, Jenn, I've really appreciated having you on to talk about this.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a hard topic. It's a heavy one. It's one that I want to be, sensitive in talking about this as well, and understanding to those people who have gone through, been victims of abuse as well, and the trauma, and certainly when it comes to the church and sex abuse, this is a really hard topic. But I think it's been important to have a bit more clarity and understanding. You've done a lot of research on this as well, and to understand the church's policies and approach when it comes to this, and what is the church's hotline doing as well. So I appreciate you coming on and having this chat.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Listeners who've been watching, if you enjoy this, give a like, share as well, comment. Don't forget to subscribe. And is there someone they could go to get more of your work or research? I think you've got like FAIR articles and FAIR conferences, but where can they go to learn more?
You can either go to the FAIR website, search my name, search church abuse. There's a whole page that lists all of them. You can also go to the YouTube channel of FAIR, FAIR, search my name or search for abuse, and all of my past videos on it will come up. Perfect. Brilliant. And don't forget to come back to my channel for more interviews as well. And I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.